In the next edition of It's About Money, my guest will be Dr. Joe Mancini, and is the author of Heroin Death, How to Stop the Opioid Crisis. It's going to be a very interesting topic, and stay tuned for that edition of It's About Money. Hello and welcome to It's About Money. I'm Nanette Nokan, and my guest at this show is Dr. Joe Mancini. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
He is the author of Heroin Death, How to Stop the Opioid Crisis. Very important topic for our discussion. So first, help me calibrate. What are opioids? I mean, I know about it from reading books in China, but help me define that for our audience.
Opioids are actually quite misunderstood by a lot of people. They go way back to opium itself, which is a product of the poppy seed plant, the very colorful poppy seed plant. And the first evidence of that plant and the opium from it goes way back to 3,300 years before Christ. So for 5,000 years, we've had opium. It wasn't until the early 1800s that the drug morphine was actually synthesized from opium. It turns out that 12% of opium is morphine. So way back over the years, opium was involved in a lot of international trade because it helped people feel good. And so it led to all sorts of interactions worldwide. Then when morphine came along, they discovered that it also is a good pain reliever. So from opium comes three what we call opiates.
Okay.
Two are well known, morphine, and the other is codeine, which is a common pain reliever. And the third one it happens to be called thebaine, but it's used to synthesize other drugs that we are familiar with, such as Vicodin, Percocet, OxyContin,
I see.
drugs like that. So it all starts with opium, and you have these three opiates, and then a whole myriad of opioids, which opioid is a broader term.
I see.
That includes the basic opiates, the semi-synthetic ones,
I see.
which come from the opium.
Okay.
And then there's what we refer to as synthetic, which are like it chemically, but are just created in a laboratory.
Got it. Okay.
So like fentanyl is coming to be known as a common one that's being also abused. So.
And so, how did it become a crisis? How does one become addicted to opiates?
Well, opiates are, I believe, more addictive than other mood-altering substances, which include everything from cocaine to alcohol to marijuana to LSD. I think what makes it most addictive of all mood-altering substances is it has some properties that the others don't. The first being that it's a direct pain reliever. So it attaches to the brain and really helps relieve pain. All other substances indirectly, will help pain, but not specifically by the way they work. The second reason they're so addictive is that they can create a euphoria that's just feels really good, and not everybody who takes them gets that euphoria. Some people get nauseous, some people don't like them, but at least 20% of the population takes an opioid and just gets this wonderful euphoric feeling,
I see.
as well as pain relief.
Got it.
And the third is that when someone withdraws from an opioid, like has been on it and stops, the withdrawal symptoms are very difficult, probably the most painful of all the other substances.
Oh my gosh.
And when someone stops cocaine, the main withdrawal is that they just get depressed, but physically no obvious effects.
I see.
With alcohol has a difficult withdrawal syndrome as well, but it's believe it or not as uncomfortable as opioids. So I believe those three things make them the most addictive of all.
So it's effective because it targets, right, relieving the pain.
Yes.
The second is the euphoria, and then the third is to help, I guess, treat.
Yeah, I mean, getting off them is difficult because of the withdrawal so difficult.
I see. Wow, that's amazing. So, do some of, or how much result in death from overdose of?
Well, that's been a big question of mine. If opium's been around for 5,000 years, how come for the last 20 we're seeing this rapid rise?
Right.
So, for example, in the spring of 1970, there were 2 deaths per month from heroin.
Okay.
In the fall, there were 2 deaths per day. So something happened in there, just from heroin, not from painkillers.
I see.
Keep in mind that heroin and narcotic painkillers are both opioids.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
So as time went on, in the mid-90s, well, let me back up. In the 80s, there was very few doctors were writing prescriptions for opioids, and there was a big concern that we were under-treating cancer pain.
Okay.
And the whole hospice movement that developed in England and came here to treat terminally ill patients with opioids was a really good thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, a group of pain specialists in the mid-80s decided that, well, if it helps cancer patients, why not treat all chronic pain with it? And it so happened that in 1996, the Purdue Pharmaceutical Company developed the drug OxyContin, which everybody has heard of, I'm sure, and is commonly misused. And the company took some very skimpy data from the 80s that implied that opioids were not addictive. Oh. And that's a long story. They were not strict studies. They were just some surveys of patients. And several of the pain specialists decided to sort of run with it and told the pharmaceutical company that opioids were not addictive. Huh. And so doctors were afraid to prescribe them because they thought they were addictive. We all did. And they misrepresented the addiction potential and proceeded to teach physicians, and what they even call remove the stigma of prescribing an opioid. So OxyContin sales took off, and then the abuse problem started in the early 2000s of the pain pills. Heroin was still around, but the pain pills took off. And it's probably not a coincidence that a class action lawsuit against Purdue, because of the side effects and people starting to die from overdose, resulted in a $600 million settlement. And 30 of it was paid by the top 3 officers. They lost their jobs and went on probation, did community service. But Purdue continued to produce it. And their justification was they made it tamper-proof, because what was happening was drug addicts who are already addicted from heroin or whatever were breaking it down and injecting it. Oh. And it was a very high dose. So they said, well, this will solve the problem. Well, it hasn't really. So over the last 20 years, along with destigmatizing opioids in the heads of physicians and Purdue misrepresenting the drug, a small town in western Mexico that was raising sugar decided to switch to opium. And this is described really brilliantly in a book called Dreamland by Sam Quinones, a journalist from LA, which I would recommend because it's a fascinating reading, but it's very telling how this small town literally has created a pizza delivery style way for people to get their heroin.
Oh my gosh. From sugar cane to pizza style delivery of
Right.
Wow.
So then within the last 5 or 7 years, physicians now were getting uptight. They were being told, no, you're prescribing too many. And so slowly the patterns are changing. And the drugs are already out there. People are getting hooked on them. So a common scenario is somebody takes one and they fall in that 20% that
Right.
it really hooks them. And then the doctor gets nervous and says, you can't have any more. And they'll often go to the street because it can be bought on the street, you know, whether it's Vicodin, Percocet, or OxyContin. And they're very expensive. Well, in comes this very cheap black tar heroin from Western Mexico that people who know who to call literally can make a phone call. An operator calls the driver. The driver puts up to 30 balloons in his mouth.
Oh, wow.
Most are young males that have come across the border. So that if they get stopped, they can swallow the,
Oh my gosh.
and not get.
But do they die when they swallow that? Oh no.
If the balloons stay intact, they don't.
They don't. I see.
just
Got
pass
it.
them.
I
But
see.
if they break, then they.
I see. Oh my
They're-
gosh. Okay.
Anyway, so what's evolved now is that, you know, from 2 deaths from heroin a month in 1970, the numbers continue to escalate. In 1999, we were up to 26 deaths per day
Oh my gosh.
from opioids, and more of them were from the pain pills.
Right.
But then in 2014, we were up to 78 a day, and by that time, it was still the pain pills more than the heroin. But then in 2015, we were up to 82 a day, and heroin has now surpassed the pills
Prescribed,
in
yes.
terms of deaths.
Oh, wow.
They're estimating that in 16, the numbers aren't out yet, that it's around 90 a day.
Oh
And
my
it's
gosh.
continuing to rise in 2017. And so, I mean, in context, deaths from opioids, which include heroin and pills, have surpassed deaths from gunshot wounds
Yes, right.
in this country.
Yeah, right.
Almost as many as motor vehicle accidents. Drug overdoses in general surpass motor vehicle accidents. Opioids constitute about 2/3 of drug overdoses.
Wow. I mean, a lot of ways you think about the auto industries come up with safety features to even lessen the deaths from automobile accidents. So
Right.
something has to be done with something that's growing at a fast trajectory.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing. Hey, can we talk briefly about the socioeconomic of economics? Does it impact a certain population, or is it like?
Great question. There's a really good book by a fellow named David Courtwright who chronicles the history of opiate addiction through the 20th century. And he points out that up until the last 20 or 30 years, heroin was confined to the inner city, jazz musicians, you know, people that were underserved, and it was all this dark sort of underworld world. What's happened now, though, since pills became so available and heroin so easy to get, is that it now is reaching all members of society. In fact, one recent study showed that 75% of new heroin users were on pills first. So these are people that might have even been put on them for good reason.
Yes.
Others are, you know, the pills are left over in the medicine cabinet and somebody's experimenting with it. And so what's happened now that the people are getting addicted and the heroin's so available, it's really all aspects, all socioeconomic groups are being affected by it.
Wow, wow, that's amazing. We'll take a quick break. Lots of great discussion. My guest is Dr. Joe Mancini, and is the author of Heroin Death, How to Stop the Opioid Crisis. We'll be right back. It's about money.
I started taking pills when I got hurt. The earlier substance use begins, the greater the chance that addiction will develop.
I thought it was fun to share with my friends at first, but then I got hooked. It stopped being fun because I needed the pills to have fun.
People who are addicted to prescription opioids are more likely to use heroin. Talk to your doctor about your prescriptions. Opioids are highly addictive and extremely dangerous.
And we're back. My guest is Dr. Joe Mancini. He's the author of Heroin Death, How to Stop the Opioid Crisis. And we're talking about really a terrible epidemic. And in terms of what piqued your interest in terms of writing about this is your specialty as a physician, but what made you think about wanting to do this?
I started working with heroin addicts in 2000. Mm-hmm. And that was before the rapid rise.
Yes.
And so it was in the days of mostly methadone treatment, and we weren't seeing the big numbers. Mm-hmm. But then over the next 20 years, or what is it now, 17 years, as these numbers have risen, having gotten to know so many and seeing the numbers rise, and then asking myself, why now? Why the rapid rise? I just sort of, it upset me.
Sure, of course, yeah.
And so I looked into it further, and I decided that a lot of people don't understand the difference between opioids and other drugs, and in particular the sudden death aspect of it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And most opioids, if you take enough, it stops the respiratory drive, and that's what causes sudden death.
Got it.
When someone dies of alcohol poisoning, it's not that it's any less traumatic, but it's a slower process. The physicians have time to maybe revive the person or save, and it's multi-organs. Whereas with this, it's very rapid. Someone can still be alert and wanting more opioids, and that next dose is just enough to tip them over, and they stop breathing. Mm-hmm. And one of the examples in my book that I just got out of the news was what happened to Prince. Mm-hmm. A week before he died, you might recall that his plane was made an emergency stop on his way home in Illinois, and he was unresponsive. And they gave him Narcan, which is the revival drug, and he came around. And luckily, they got him there in time before his breathing, really knocked him out. But then at home, when he was alone in his elevator, the papers reported he was dependent on painkillers. He never got to heroin, but he got to fentanyl, which is about 100 times stronger than morphine. Mm. And one of the issues with so many people is that if they're taking fentanyl, they don't know really how powerful it is. If they're taking heroin, they don't really know what they're buying, and a lot of the distributors are putting fentanyl in the heroin.
Oh man!
So it's once somebody switches, it's really very dangerous.
Your tolerance, and I mean, there's a certain level, I'm sure, but yeah. Wow, that's amazing. Okay, and then what can be how to stop it? Can you talk about that a little bit, because that's
okay. My favorite topic.
Yes.
It involves two drugs. Mm-hmm. It's, not to boil it down or oversimplify it. I like to, in broad categories, put it into three categories: prevention, treatment, and rescue. Going backwards, the rescue part is the what happened to Prince when he was rescued. If someone happens to be there with Narcan, the rescue drug, which is an opioid antagonist. Mm-hmm. So it reverses the effects immediately. Mm-hmm. We've been using that in emergency rooms for 40 years. Okay. But now it's become very common. Policemen are being trained to use it. Firemen are being trained, luckily.
Yes.
you hear of librarians being trained because, kids are passing out and they don't know if it's the opioid or not.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So the rescue part is if somebody's there at the right time and knows what to do, kind of like CPR,
Sure, sure. Right.
someone can be saved.
Mm-hmm.
And so the awareness of Narcan is is increasing. People are getting more comfortable using it, prescribing it. Some states you can get it over the counter. So that's the rescue part. The treatment part is when somebody is already addicted to opioids. We need, I think, to aggressively treat people, and instead of putting them in jail, the numbers of people in jail for nonviolent drug crimes where they weren't even selling, they just had the drug, are very high. And they don't get treatment in jail, and then they come out and they start again.
Yes, right.
And it's often a risky period when someone comes out of jail because their tolerance has dropped since they've been off it.
Yes, I see what you mean.
They go to their old dose and they can overdose. So that involves a lot of money, a lot of commitment, a lot of public funding. I mean, we hear about commissions paying attention to it, and hopefully it'll coordinate with a better. I don't want to show my bias here, but a better health system that it will actually get paid for. The prevention part is actually my favorite subject because up until 2003, the main drug we used to treat opioid addicts was methadone, which has been around since about 1970. Now, methadone carries a lot of baggage with it, has a lot of stigma to it. For people to get it, they have to show up every day at a clinic and drink it in front of the person, and it also can be abused, and people can die from it. In 2003, an old drug was finally approved by the FDA to treat opioid addicts, and it happens to be safer than methadone. The brand name that most people are familiar with is called Suboxone, the main ingredient of which is a drug called buprenorphine. So what I try to describe in my book is how buprenorphine is the one drug, the one opioid, that a person cannot overdose on. By the way, it's chemically built.
I see.
Unfortunately, physicians are afraid to prescribe it.
Well, how so?
When it was rolled out in 2003, the fear was that physicians would just create pill mills and hand it out. And even though it's safer than methadone, they required something that's never been required to prescribe any other drug, which was an 8-hour certification course.
Oh, okay.
And a special DEA number.
I see.
Which was sort of a nuisance.
Yeah, right.
And I remember back in those days, I would say to my friends, listen, get this certification, and they'd say, no, we don't want heroin addicts sitting in our office. I had to remind them that probably 10 to 20% of their patients were probably already dependent.
Yeah, right.
And it's a safe drug. You can't overdose on it. And believe it or not, there's fewer than 20,000 physicians who have done the certification, and fewer than 5,000 of the million doctors in this country that actually prescribe it. So my theory, and it's a good pain reliever.
I see.
Just a short personal story, I hurt my shoulder. I went into my doctor, and he said, do you want Vicodin? I said, no, I want some buprenorphine. And he looked at me like I was asking for a head transplant. He said, oh, I don't do that. I don't do that. And I said, why not? He said, oh, you need the pain specialist. And I said, well, if I need a pain specialist, I'm way past buprenorphine. It's a good starter drug if a doctor feels an opioid is necessary, because it can cause some mild dependency, but people don't get addicted to it in the same way they get to all the other opioids, that
Yes.
they've got to have it
Right.
because the withdrawal symptoms are very mild. So someone could actually be put on this as their first opioid. So I'm trying to build the case and convince physicians that if they think someone needs an opioid, that buprenorphine would be the first.
I see.
And it decreases the risk of addiction.
Right.
It's very effective for pain.
Yes.
And so that's, you know.
But the hurdle is the certification, right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, up until 6 months ago, the hurdle was the certification.
Okay.
However, it was certified, or the FDA approved it for addiction treatment.
Okay. That's
so-
good. That's good news.
Which is good. But 6 months ago, the FDA approved a low dose form of it, lower than the addiction dose,
Okay.
that any physician can prescribe.
Oh, okay. Well, that's fantastic.
So, but most physicians don't know that. I went into my other regular physician. I said, do you prescribe buprenorphine for pain? She goes, no, it's just too mysterious. And I said, well,
Let me tell you.
so I gave her my lecture. So I firmly believe that if physicians, it may take a while to shift the mindset and get over the fear of it.
Right.
It's just ironic because it's the safest of all opioids, and yet it's you know, the mysteriousness of it and the fear of it really prevails.
Right. That's amazing, 'cause it makes me think that because of what had happened with other treatments in the past, they've put a lot of fencing around it so that it's overprotected. And then the physicians are like, oh, wait, I don't want to do that because that happened. So I can understand the perspective, but it sounds like it's a matter of educating them.
Well, exactly. That's, I think, what has to be done.
Yeah.
It's ironic. You know, the CDC and the FDA and addiction societies have tried to change doctors' attitudes about prescribing fewer opioids, and it's working. You know, since 2012, the prescribing of opioids has leveled off.
Nice. That's good.
But the death rate continues to rise because the switch has been made to heroin.
Yes, I see.
So
From
it started,
states,
yeah.
Got it. Wow.
So we have to be more aggressive, just changing prescribing habits, unless I can convince 1 million doctors to change to buprenorphine.
I see. I mean, you might be able to.
I don't know.
So it's great. Now I understand. I mean, it is a horrible epidemic, and it's cost a lot of lives, and of course the economic impact of that. People losing family members, you know, breadwinners. Just if it's 20% of the population, that's a huge number.
Yeah. One other figure you might find interesting from an economic standpoint. The National Safety Council, which studies workplace safety, surveyed 500 companies with 50 or more employees, and 70% of these companies acknowledged that they had employees that were struggling with narcotic pain pills or heroin.
Wow.
And 75% of those companies don't have any sort of plan on how to deal with it.
Sure. Yeah.
And the ones that drug test, 40% of those don't even test for opioids.
Oh wow.
They test
They're
for
missing.
marijuana or whatever.
Right.
So we're missing a lot of opportunities to, you know, intervene.
Sure. And then we're screening for a portion of
We're
what
screening
the
for the
potential crisis that is there.
right,
Wow.
exactly.
Well, thank you so much. You have so much more to talk about, but I run out of time, and I'm just really appreciative of you spending the time to educate myself and my viewers about this crisis, and thank you for the work you've done. So that's great.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks our viewers for joining us. My guest has been Dr. Joe Mancini, and he's the author of Heroin Death, How to Stop the Opioid Crisis. Thank you. Until next time, I'm Nanette Nocon. It's about money.